A colony does not look weak when it is about to swarm. It looks like the most vigorous colony in the apiary. The frames are packed with bees. The entrance is humming with traffic. The brood nest is full. To every external indicator, this colony is performing exactly as it should. And yet within 72 hours, it will lose its queen, half its foraging force, and the majority of its wax-producing workers. Not to disease, not to collapse, but to a biological process the colony itself has been orchestrating for weeks without a single visible warning sign most beekeepers would recognize. Have you experienced this in your own hives? A colony that seemed strong, that you walked away from confident, only to find it halved when you returned a few days later. If that question landed close to home, a like on this video helps this kind of content reach more beekeepers who need it. Swarming is the most misread event in colony biology. Most beekeepers treat it as a sudden failure, something the bees decided quickly, almost impulsively. But the behavioral and physiological cascade leading to a swarm begins not hours before the event, but weeks before, and it reaches a critical observable threshold approximately 72 hours before departure. That window is real, it is documented, and it is readable if you know what you are looking for. Moses Quinby, writing in 1853, described the swarm impulse as something the colony builds toward, not something that erupts from it. He wrote that a beekeeper who watches carefully enough will see the change before the swarm flies. What he was describing in the language of his era was a behavioral shift that modern colony biology has since mapped in specific, measurable terms. What most beekeepers misunderstand is this. They search for swarm cells as the primary indicator of imminent swarming, and while swarm cells are important, they are not the signal that marks the 72-hour window. Swarm cells can be present for 10 days or more before the colony actually departs. The cells alone do not tell you where you are in the timeline. The behaviors do. Swarm cells present. Swarm date unknown. This is the problem. The presence of queen cells places you somewhere within a 2-week window. The behavioral cluster that precedes the actual swarm event narrows that window to 3 days. Understanding the difference is what separates reactive swarm management from anticipatory swarm management. The dominant biological mechanism driving the 72-hour pre-swarm window is not queen cell development, though that is its backdrop. It is a coordinated physiological shift across 3 distinct populations within the colony simultaneously: the laying queen, the nurse bee cohort, and the forager core. These 3 groups shift state at the same time, and the combined signal they produce is detectable if you are inspecting with that specific question in your mind. Begin with the queen. In the weeks leading up to a swarm, the colony has been feeding her richly and consistently, supporting a laying rate that fills the brood nest and crowds the cluster. But approximately 5 to 8 days before the swarm flies, something changes. The workers begin to reduce her food intake. They harass her. They pursue her through the comb. The biological consequence is that her abdomen, which has been distended and heavy with eggs, begins to slim. She loses mass. Her ovaries reduce output. Her laying rate drops measurably. This is not incidental. A queen that cannot fly cannot lead a swarm. The colony is preparing her body for sustained flight days before it needs her to make it. By the time you reach the 72-hour mark, this slimming is already well underway. A queen that would normally be moving steadily across the comb, laying into every available cell, is instead moving in shorter, more erratic patterns. She may be difficult to locate. Beekeepers often interpret a hard-to-find queen as a sign the colony is queenless or failing. In a swarm-ready colony, it may instead mean the queen is being actively harassed and is in the final stages of her pre-flight physiological preparation. The second shift is occurring in the nurse bee and younger worker population. In the days before a swarm departs, a significant portion of the colony begins gorging on honey. This is not feeding behavior in the conventional sense. It is fuel loading. A bee that fills its honey stomach before swarming carries approximately 3 days of energy reserve for the swarm cluster. This mass gorging event is why swarm clusters can survive for days in exposed locations while scout bees search for a permanent cavity. Root Cyclopedia of American Bee Culture, in its early 20th century editions, described the swarm cluster as a self-contained unit, a complete functional colony in compressed, mobile form. What Root was observing from the outside was the result of this internal preparation, a colony that had preloaded its departure group with enough energy to operate independently of any food source for several days. Here is where the timing risk becomes acute. If a beekeeper inspects a colony during this gorging phase, typically 2 to 5 days before the swarm flies, and does not recognize the behavioral shift for what it is, they will likely close up the hive, report the colony as strong, and return to find it halved. The gorging behavior makes the bees appear calm, almost lethargic. They are not lethargic, they are loading. The third observable shift occurs in the foraging population. Experienced foragers, the bees that make up the majority of the honey-producing workforce, begin reducing their flight activity in the final 72 hours before swarm departure. This is counterintuitive. A colony about to swarm during a nectar flow should, by logic, be increasing forager activity to capitalize on available forage. Instead, foragers begin to idle at the entrance, clustering on the landing board and the lower face of the hive in numbers that exceed what the temperature or time of day would explain. Langstroth noted in his foundational writings that a hive entrance crowded with inactive bees in warm weather, particularly in late spring or early summer, warranted careful attention. He was describing what is now understood as forager aggregation, the early stages of swarm cluster formation that begin hours before the full swarm issues from the hive. Entrance crowded, foragers idle, clock is running. If you value biology-based beekeeping, consider subscribing. The practical question is how to use this information at the hive. The 72-hour diagnostic is not a passive observation, it is a structured inspection approach. When examining any colony that already has capped or near-capped swarm cells, the inspection should include 3 specific behavioral checks that go beyond cell counting. First, locate the queen and assess her condition. A queen that is slim, actively being pursued by workers, or difficult to locate on a full frame of bees despite a steady search should be noted. A queen in normal pre-swarm production mode will be moving steadily, surrounded by a clear retinue. A queen in the slimming phase moves differently, faster, more erratically, with a smaller and less stable retinue around her. Second, assess the entrance behavior specifically. In the final 72 hours, the entrance pattern changes in character. Forager return traffic does not stop entirely, but the proportion of bees standing at the entrance relative to bees actively flying increases. Look for bees that land, walk to the lower edge of the entrance, and simply stop. Bees that should be re-entering the hive or rejoining flight instead cluster. This is the formation of the pre-swarm holding position. Third, look at the upper frames for any unusual warmth or movement in the cluster during an inspection. The bees gorging on honey will be concentrated toward the center and upper portions of the brood nest. If the upper frames feel unusually warm for the ambient temperature, and the bees on those frames are relatively still rather than engaged in typical comb activity, the gorging phase is likely in progress. A common mistake at this stage is to remove all visible swarm cells under the assumption that doing so halts the process. In a colony that has already entered the 72-hour behavioral window, swarm cell removal without other intervention is rarely effective. The colony's impulse to swarm is not stored in the cells alone. It is distributed across the physiology and behavior of the entire population. Removing cells from a colony in which the queen is already slimming and foragers are already idling does not reset that physiological state. The colony will often rebuild cells within hours or proceed toward departure if the impulse is sufficiently advanced. The effective intervention at the 72-hour mark is not removal of cells, but redistribution of population pressure. The colony is swarming because its biological balance between brood production, honey storage, and cluster density has reached a threshold the colony resolves by dividing. Adding a super alone will not resolve this at the 72-hour mark. The intervention that changes the outcome is splitting the population before the swarm does it for you. A split made during this window, ideally with a capped swarm cell left in the original colony, accomplishes what the swarm was preparing to accomplish biologically. A division of the population into 2 functional units, each with sufficient bees and resources to continue independently. The difference is that the beekeeper controls the outcome. The swarm controls nothing about its outcome once it leaves the hive. The decision window here is genuinely narrow. Once the swarm issues from the hive, once the queen exits, the cluster forms in the air, and the bees begin their short-term holding pattern in a nearby tree or fence post, the split opportunity has passed. The beekeeper is now in swarm recovery mode rather than swarm prevention mode. Those are 2 very different positions to be in, and the biology that determines which one applies was readable 3 days earlier. Quinby wrote that the bees will tell the attentive beekeeper everything they need to know, if the beekeeper has learned what to look for. He wrote that in 1853, the biology he was describing has not changed. What has changed is how much detail careful observation has since added to that core insight. and how precisely the pre-swarm behavioral cascade can now be identified if the inspection is designed to look for it. The 72-hour window is not a guarantee. Not every colony that enters the behavioral cluster will swarm before the beekeeper can intervene, but every colony that swarms will have moved through that window. Understanding it transforms inspection from a checklist into a biological conversation, one the bees have been conducting for weeks before a single bee leaves the hive. The bees are not unpredictable. They follow a sequence. The beekeeper's task is simply to learn the sequence well enough to read it before it concludes. If this breakdown was useful, leave a comment with your experience. Subscribe for more historically grounded beekeeping insights.